Hello. Hello. Hi, good morning. If you are on the East Coast, good afternoon. Today we will study a few additional patterns for the basic simple sentences. We will build upon what we have already learned. And today's examples are actually quite interesting because logically the patterns will become more complicated. But if we understand what we have already learned, then the logical extension will be quite obvious. So that's why I prefer every learner of grammar to think about grammar as a very logical thing. Keep a mathematical mind when you study grammar. It's very important to see it from that perspective so that when you see the inner working of all the rules, you have a very consistent and logically well organized way of understanding how grammar works. So let's recap. Once again, so far we have studied 7 patterns for the basic simple English sentences. And among those 7, you can see that pattern 6 and 7 are just very analogous to pattern number 1 and 2, where you just replace the be verb with a linking verb. So pattern 1 and 2 are all about complement. So are pattern 6 and 7. But here, complement is for the subject. And today we will see later that when we will have a different type of complement, and that is for object. And you will see that in those 7 patterns, only pattern number 5 will contain an object. And it turns out that pattern number 5 happens to be the most common English sentence structures. That is the so-called SVO structure. You have a subject, you have a verb, which is a transitive verb. And because it's a transitive verb, it will require an object. That's why we call it the SVO for this pattern number 5. And later today, we'll see that we can extend or borrow the same idea of subject complement to object complement. Okay, that's the perspective for today's study. But let's first consider a new thing, the indirect object. And this is a very confusing grammar point in English. So if you just do not pay attention, you will struggle this concept with the rest of your life. So very important to pay attention to what we are discussing. Okay, let's take a look at the following sentence. The king gave his love. Is this a complete sentence? Is this pattern number 5? The king gave his love. Well, we have a transitive verb, give, which requires an object, but we do have an object here, love. You probably think that this is not a complete sentence because it seems that the idea is not complete. The king gave his love to whom? You're right. This sentence is not a complete sentence because this particular verb give when it has a object love, logically we would want to know where does this love go, right? So typically when you have a transitive verb, you have an action, and that action has a recipient. That's the object of the transitive verb. The object receives that action. However, for certain type of verbs, this object itself may need another recipient. In this case, the king gave his love to someone, and that someone will be the recipient of love. So, in other words, logically, you can see that this is kind of a chain of just this passing, receiving action. The king performs an action, which is a give. And this give action has a recipient, which is love. Love is receiving this action, giving. But love itself needs another recipient. So, how should we complete the idea in this sentence? Well, we need something like this. The king gave his love to Anne Boleyn. By the way, Anne Boleyn was a queen in England. So the king gave his love to Anne Boleyn. And we see that this to Anne Boleyn, what is this? This is a prepositional phrase, right? And we have already learned a prepositional phrase typically either works as an adjectival modifier or as an adverbial modifier. Here, what kind of modifier is this? To Anne Boleyn. So this to Anne Boleyn gave us an idea, where does the love go? It goes to Anne Boleyn. Therefore, this cannot be adjectival because this to Anne Boleyn does not modify love. Well, what does it modify? Well, if you think carefully, this modifies a verb, give, right? It tells us this giving action, where does this action is going? Okay, so in this case, we can think about logically this to Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn is the recipient of this object, love. It works in the way we use a prepositional phrase to Anne Boleyn. To logically, grammatically, to Anne Boleyn modifies gave. But logically, Anne Boleyn is a recipient of this object verb. So it seems that we have another object that is associated with this verb, give. And it turns out for this type of verbs, they have two objects. One is the direct one, which is love. Love is the direct recipient of this action, give. Then itself has another recipient, which is Anne Boleyn. So we call this an indirect object. So the verb give has two objects. One is a direct one because that's where the action is upon love. So love is the direct object of give. But Anne Boleyn, as the recipient of the object, the direct object itself becomes the indirect object. Okay? So we call this an indirect object of the verb give. So how do we diagram this sentence? Well, as we said, to Boleyn grammatically function as a prepositional phrase which is adverbial, and it modifies the main verb gave here. Therefore, we have to put it here. It's very important to understand how this works, because without this understanding, we will see pattern number A, which will come up next. It will be very confusing. So we have to emphasize that grammatically, this to Boleyn modifies gave. And logically, Boleyn is the indirect object for the verb give. And it's the recipient of the direct object love. Okay, so with this understanding, now we are ready to study pattern number 8. But before that, we want to review, well, this is not a review. We just take a quick look at what kind of verbs typically will have two objects, meaning that they will have an indirect object. So not every verb will have this. And it's relatively a small fraction or proportion of all the transitive verbs that will actually have two objects, one direct one, one indirect one. So when a verb expresses a notion such as giving, offering, making, sending, and so on, you can logically see those verbs will, they themselves will need a direct object. But with those very actions, those activities, you can imagine the direct object will need their own recipient, which would be the indirect object to complete the idea. Okay, so telling, buying, building, all those things. The list cannot be exhausted, but you get the idea, you get the feeling of what kind of actions require such a second object. So when you have this something with a prepositional phrase, and this is very important, a good rule. When you have a prepositional phrase for such indirect object, in almost all cases, you will either have to or for. To someone or for someone, or to something for something. Okay? So this is a very reliable rule. There's almost no exception to this. Either to or for. Okay? So that's a very helpful hint for how to use this correctly. Okay. So in this case, the object of the preposition is the indirect object of the verb. And the preposition is either to or for. Okay, so those verbs having, of course, the specific verbs may even vary. Those description only give you a general concept, a feeling of what kind of activities typically will require two objects. Okay. For example, we already saw the king gave his love to Anne Boleyn. Kai built a new gaming computer for Aaron. So you see that in the second one, we have for. Okay. The first one, we have two. So the diagramming of those will be quite similar, but the one we see that in the second one is the same as to Anne Boleyn. For Aaron, it modifies the verb build. Okay, so you may think that for Aaron modifies computer, but that's not an adjectival sense, right? For Aaron, think about it. For Aaron, it's not actually modifying computer. It's modifying build. Okay? It's the purpose of this action build. It's not something, a property or trait associated with computer. Therefore, you can see that in this diagram, for Aaron, should be diagrammed beneath build. Okay? Now, so this is what we have already discussed. The indirect object is the receiver of the direct object. But logically, it answers this question: to whom, to what, or for whom, for what. Okay? So the indirect object modifies the verb. Now, we're ready to study a new pattern for simple sentence. Well, this pattern is just a kind of just shortcut to what we just discussed. And this pattern is, you have subject, you have transitive verb. Now you see something interesting. We have indirect object, non-direct object. What does that mean? Well, we just said that the king gave his love to Anne Boleyn. The very same sentence can be also said in this way: the king gave Anne Boleyn his love. We probably have already seen a sentence like this very often, right? Look, this is different from the sentence we just studied. The king gave his love to Anne Boleyn. What pattern is that? That was pattern number 5. If we cannot remember what we have, the king gave love to Anne Boleyn. If you look at, that's why sentence diagram is very helpful. If you are not sure, just look at this diagram. This is what pattern number 5 looks like, right? You have subject, you have verb, you have a direct object of the transitive verb, 1, 2, 3. You have 3 slots above the main line. Everything else, they're just modifiers. And in this case, the indirect object appears as a prepositional phrase, and that only can modify gave, not love. And this is classic pattern number 5. But now, this version of the same sentence, this is different. The king gave Anne Boleyn his love. Because we have a solid understanding of the previous sentence, we see that in this case, logically, this sentence says exactly the same thing as the one with the prepositional phrase, right? Because logically, this is the very same action, nothing changed. The only thing changed is how we present the idea in English. But here, we see that it seems that gave, a lot of students will get confused with this sentence. They will think that in this sentence, Anne Boleyn is the direct object of gave. That is wrong. Because logically, this is exactly the same thing as the earlier prepositional phrase version of the sentence. Nothing changed. So love is still the recipient of the action given, not Anne Boleyn. Otherwise, it looks like, if you think about this carefully, if Anne Boleyn is the direct object of a give, that means that the king gave this woman to someone. Sounds like slavery scene, right? How can you give a person to someone? You cannot. Anne Boleyn is truly the recipient of the love, not this giving action. So, how do we understand this sentence? Well, this is sentence pattern number 8. In this case, we put the indirect object in front of the direct object. That sounds weird, but it is what it is. So, love is still the direct object of the verb, give. And Anne Boleyn is still the indirect object because that's the recipient of love. So, the proper way to understand this sentence is just to understand it as an alternative version of the sentence we just learned with the prepositional phrase. but that one was pattern number 5. Here, this cannot be possibly pattern number 5. We have something right after the object, right? That's why this is kind of unique. So we separate this out as a new pattern, and that is a subject, a transitive verb, an indirect object. Then you plus the direct object. The funny thing is that with this understanding, how do you diagram this sentence? We already said that the importance of diagram is to help us to understand the sentence structure, and every single word should have some kind of appear somehow, somewhere in the diagram. Every single word. Otherwise, it won't make sense. So how do we diagram this sentence? Well, we have to base on what we have already done with the prepositional phrase. So logically, this is just a short way, a shortcut to what we just saw earlier with that prepositional phrase, which is 2 or 4 a preposition phrase. Just think about this sentence is just a kind of shortened version, or a little bit more just speedy way of saying the same thing. Now, because we put the indirect object in front of the direct object, we remove that preposition, 2. But otherwise, the 2 logically should be exactly the same. Therefore, we will diagram this in almost exactly the same way as the earlier version of the diagram. So the diagram will treat the indirect object, which is Anne Boleyn here, as a prepositional phrase, and still place it under the verb. Because only this way we can treat both versions consistently. This is very confusing, okay? Because they look so different, but the diagrams will look almost the same, except we don't have a preposition here. And that will be the confusing part. So, how do we diagram this sentence? We still follow first. We have King gave his love. We know this is a direct object. We have this indirect object, but it appears between the verb and the direct object. How do we diagram it? We made it up something like this. We treat it as a prepositional phrase, but without the preposition. And typically we put something like this. A lot of books do this. Some books simply just without putting anything on this diagonal line. But that could cause some confusion. So I personally think this will be a better way. There's nothing here. So we put an X mark in the parentheses here on this diagonal line to tell. Remember, a diagram is just a tool to help us. Nobody asks you to do any diagram if you don't want to. It's just a tool helping us to understand the structure of a sentence. So for that general purpose, it will help if you put something like you put an X in the parentheses on this diagonal line to indicate that logically there's a preposition here, but in reality, it doesn't exist. So we put something into a parenthesis. So this will look exactly the same as if we have the earlier version, 2 Anne Boleyn, but without the actual preposition 2. So this looks like a prepositional phrase with a diagonal line and with a horizontal line which put the object there, and the whole thing appears beneath gave, indicating that this grammatically modifies gave. That completes the diagramming for this particular pattern number 8. So if you understand the pattern number 5 version of the same sentence and how you should diagram that one, this one is almost exactly the same, except we don't have an actual preposition here, but this strongly indicates that grammatically this is very similar to the other version. Okay? I know this is confusing. It is confusing. It's very important to understand what we are doing here and why we are doing it this way. All right? So, this is actually quite an important class of sentences because while relatively speaking, those verbs are relatively just a small fraction, but still quite a lot. And we use this particular sentence structure all the time. Okay, there's one caveat. You will see some versions in some books like this without that, but I think putting it there will make it less confusing. Let's just put it that way. So there is a caveat to this particular sentence. If the direct object is a pronoun instead of a noun or noun phrase, we haven't formally discussed what a noun phrase means, but you just can imagine it's just a phrase rather than a single word, but logically it's just still a noun. So if the direct object is a pronoun, then only the prepositional phrase version can be used for the indirect object. If you say the sentence this way, the king gave Anne Boleyn it. This is ungrammatical. Why? Because here, we don't have that love, his love, which is noun phrase, love. We have a pronoun for it. It here refers to love. Because it's a pronoun, you cannot write the sentence this way, meaning that simply put the indirect object before the direct object it. If you say the king gave Anne Boleyn it, this is ungrammatical. So why? There's no why. It's just idiomatic. We don't accept it. We don't say it that way in English. Therefore, if you use the pronoun it rather than the noun love, you can only say this sentence in the prepositional phrase version. The king gave it to Anne Boleyn. Okay? And of course, the diagram will just be that. Oops, there's two missed. Sorry, there should be two here. I need to fix this diagram. Just make it clear there is a two here. Okay? The king gave it to Anne Boleyn. Okay, now pattern number 8 is very important, okay? Because it's not just important, it's also very confusing because a lot of students cannot get it, what is the indirect object and why it just appears that way. So many students think that the indirect object is the direct object. That is wrong. If you keep a very sharp mathematical mind, you will see why it's wrong. Okay? Now we're ready to move on to the next pattern. And as we promised, the proper way to understand actually the next two patterns is to understand pattern number 1, number 2, and the number 6, number 6 and number 7. So let's take a look. Number 1 and number 2, subjective complement. And the difference between the two versions is that the first one, we have an adjective as the complement. This will describe the subject. Pattern number 2, we have a noun as the complement. This is just rename the subject. It just refers back to the same thing, right? The king is a nice man. Man refers to king. So the two are essentially the same thing. Similarly, if we replace the be verb with a linking verb, we get pattern number 6 and number 7. But other than that, they're essentially the same thing as pattern 1 and pattern 2. So the next two patterns, pattern number 9 and number 10, will kind of parallel this concept. We have a complement of something, but not of the subject. What are the complement for? Would be this number 5. And we say number 5 is perhaps the most important pattern in English sentence. That's the SVO structure. And this is unique because among those 7 patterns, only number 5 has a second non-element, which is an object. And that object is the transitive verb. So we will see how we need something to complete the idea about the object instead of subject. So that's why we will have pattern number 9. Okay, pattern number 9, we have subject, a transitive verb, a direct object. So far, that's just pattern number 5. Now, we add a complement to this object. Just logically analogous to how we add a complement to the subject in pattern 1 and 6. Okay? So this time we just add a complement to the object, and it's an adjective. The next pattern number 10 would be the noun version of for the complement, but that will be analogous to pattern number 2 and 7. Okay? So the king considered Anne beautiful. Let's take a pause here. Actually, first of all, not all transitive verb will be able to do something like this. Just like not all verbs will have 2 objects, one direct, one indirect one. Not all verbs or all transitive verbs will be able to get a object complement. But more confusing, even when some verbs do, they will have a different meaning if we remove the complement. For some verbs, they have to have this complement. But for some verbs, we actually do not have the object complement, but the whole meaning of the sentence will change. So that's why we take a pause here. The king considered Anne beautiful. Here, beautiful, what does beautiful do? Beautiful modifies Anne, right? Modifies, it just describes something about Anne. Anne is a beautiful woman. And the king thinks Anne is beautiful. So beautiful completes something, some idea about Anne, not king. Apparently, beautiful is a trait or some just a characteristics about Anne, not Anne. So therefore, it's a compliment for Anne, not king. But the point we need to make here is, if we drop this beautiful, will this sentence be complete? The king considered Anne. Yes, it is a complete sentence, but it's something very different. How do we make sense of this sentence, the king considered Anne? It could be answer, say, the king is evaluating a pool of candidates for some job, maybe an ambassador to France, or some just government official. The king is selecting some candidates to do the job. Now we can say the king considered Anne. In that case, this sentence, the king considered Anne, if in that meaning, it's totally different from the intended meaning here. Here, consider is in a remarkably different meaning. King considered, meaning that can think about N. But that thinking process is not complete until we supply additional information about N. Consider N to be what? The king consider N is beautiful. So beautiful here is a complement for the object. Okay? So if beautiful is removed, this sentence will have a quite different meaning. At least not the same meaning as intended here for consider. It's a different consider. Okay. So beautiful truly modifies N here and completes the intended meaning of the sentence. A good test is that if you can plug in this to be structure into the sentence and the sentence still makes sense, then you can tell this is a object complement. Say, the king considered N to be beautiful. If you can plug in this and the sentence still sounds right to you, then you know this beautiful is just complement. And complement of the object and here to be, right? And to be. Okay. Because in this case, if you do say the sentence this way, this is actually an infinitive, but that's a different story because we will not discuss that today. But it's just an ear test. Whether you think when you read this loud to yourself, whether this sentence makes sense. Okay? The diagram of this sentence is different. Now we see something we have never seen before. Now we add the fourth slot to the main line, above the main line. So in this case, we will have came, which is subject, consider, which is the transitive verb, and that's the direct object of the transitive verb. Then we have finally the last slot you will ever see above the main line. That's the complement for the object. And just similar to the subjective complement, which is a backward diagonal line, we do exactly the same thing. We use instead of a vertical bar, we use a backward diagonal line here to point back, in this case, not point back to Kim, but point back to N, indicating that this is the complement and it points back to the thing that it completes. So that's N. So the king consider N beautiful. That's how you diagram this pattern number 9. Okay? Hopefully that makes a lot of sense to you. Okay? Now, we will, because this is just in parallel, so not surprisingly, we will have a noun version for this so-called object complement. Okay? That just makes sense, right? Earlier we said that we can have this version for the subject, why not for the object as well? And that's exactly what we have. So pattern number 10 is subject, transitive verb, direct object, then object complement in the form of a noun rather than an adjective. Remember, in the case of pattern number 1 and the 6, we just say this noun version of the complement is just another name of the subject, right? And here, the logic is exactly the same. This complement would be just another name for the direct object. And let's take a look how it works. The king consider N a beauty. Does that make sense to you? No, yeah, the logic is exactly the same. Instead of describing N, we just gave N another name. N is a beauty. So the king consider N a beauty. A beautiful lady, but we just use the noun beauty to say that in a simpler way. So the king consider N a beauty. Now you see how it works. We have an object, then we add additional information about this object, completes the idea, but in a way that is a noun that just gives an a different referent, a different name. It does complete the idea at the same time. If we will, we can say from this point out, the beauty, blah, 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 blah. Using beauty to replace the name Anne, because now we know what beauty refers to. Beauty refers to Anne. It's just another name for Anne. Okay? So that's the point. Of course, just like earlier, if we remove this beauty, the king consider Anne. Yeah, the sentence still works, but it has a very different meaning. Okay, that consider is not the same consider here. Okay, this version of consider needs a complement. King consider Anne to be something just to complete that idea. Okay, so just like a beautiful, a beauty modifies Anne and completes the intended meaning of the sentence. By the way, the two versions, beautiful and beauty, the meaning is the same, right? The king considered Anne beautiful, or the king considered Anne a beauty. They exactly mean the same thing, but it's just a different way of saying it. That really makes our just writing just rich. We have different tools. We have different ways to express the same idea, which is good. Once again, you can use this to be the king considered Anne to be a beauty. This is a good test. Always. How do you diagram this? Well, because you already know how to diagram pattern number 2 and the number 7, which are just analogous to number 1 and the number 6. Not surprisingly, this pattern number 10, the diagramming will look analogous to pattern number 9. We still have the 4th slot, and that's for complement. The exception is we don't have an adjective here. We have a noun here. The king considered Anne a beauty. So exactly the same way, it's just a different type of part of speech here. So you have a backward diagonal, meaning that this word points back to Anne, and it's a noun. That's it. So now we are almost at the end of studying. We still have one more pattern that we have not studied. That will be kind of analogous to pattern number 3, which is number 11. We have a obligatory adverb for some versions of pattern number 5, but we will discuss it next in the next lecture. But right now, you can see that when we have an object, we can further extend our base sentence structures, make it richer. But there are some confusions when you think about it, especially say, once we have a direct object, now we have see 2 ways to add additional information. One is an indirect object. Another one is a complement. They both apply, add something about the object, but in a very different way, right? So we need to make some distinctions. But before doing that, just like we review what kind of verbs can have an indirect object, we think about what kind of verbs that can have object complements, okay? So again, not every verb can do that. And it's a relatively small proportion of all the transitive verbs that can actually have a complement, objective complement. So those verbs involve the act of making, selecting, using, discriminating judgment. What does that mean? Well, we will see the verbs when we actually see that. So the common verbs used to form pattern number 10, number 9 and 10, this is make, consider, think, judge, prefer, select, elect, nominate, vote, choose, and so on. Of course, those just give you the general idea about the actions you will have. The specific words can vary, right? Because each of those action, I should say, can have many different verbs corresponding to that action. Okay, so let's take a look at some example. All students elect M. Albert the president of the class. So elect is such a verb. Elect Albert to be the president of the class, right? So elect Albert, if we don't have that, that also makes sense. But the meaning would be kind of, just as compared to this version, incomplete. Unless you have already say what the election is about. If you just say all students elect Albert, that's not a complete idea. Elect Albert what? We don't know what you're talking about, elect Albert. You have to put a context to that sentence, which is okay. But in this version, you'll see that elect Albert president. President is a compliment because it tells what kind of person Albert is. Albert becomes the president. So after this sentence, we just say the president of the class. We will understand that means Albert. Okay? So Albert is the object and the president is the complement in this sentence. Okay, the diagram is quite clear. So all students elect Albert the president of the class. Okay. So now let's discuss a little bit, and this is actually could be confusing to someone, but so you will see that we will make a distinction that is between pattern number 8 and the number 10. Recall what is number 8? We just discussed today. Number 8, we have an indirect object to object. And number 10 is that we have a complement to the object. So sometimes they may look a little bit similar, and that causes confusion. So think about those two sentences. The king offered Anne a crown. So in this case, what is the direct object? The direct object is a crown, not Anne, right? The king offered Anne a crown. That's why a lot of people will get confused. You have to think carefully about what verb is involved here. Is offer? What is the direct recipient of this offer action? Offer what? Offered Anne? No, cannot be. Anne is the person, cannot be offered. The direct object must be crown. That is the recipient of this very action, offer. Anne cannot be the recipient of offer. Anne can only be the recipient of the crown. So, in number 8, pattern number 8 here, Anne is the indirect object. And the next sentence, the king made Anne a queen. How should we understand this sentence? We cannot understand this sentence as the king made the queen for Anne or to Anne. That's not the meaning. If you say the king made Anne a pizza, yeah, that's a different thing. And made a pizza for Anne. But here is made Anne a queen. The only way to understand this sentence is that Anne becomes a queen, right? And in this case, what is the object? Cannot be queen. Queen cannot be made. you cannot say the king made the queen forward to N. So queen is N. N is queen. So therefore, N is the direct object here. N is the recipient of this action, making. The king made N. Made N what? To be what? To be a queen. So the king made N a queen. You compare this sentence to the sentence above, they look quite similar. The structure very similar, but because of the different meaning or natures of the verb involved, they are two completely different sentences, both of course meaning and the grammatical structure. Okay, so the king offered Anne a crown. That's pattern number 8. We have an object and we have direct object, we have indirect object. The next sentence is pattern number 10. We have direct object and we have object complement. That is queen. So that's what we just understand. For number 8, the king offered Anne a crown. We say that, we can use that. In this version, I did not put the X marks there. If you want, you can. You don't have to. But it's important to understand N here. It's just logically, grammatically, it's equivalent to that 2N. Therefore, we diagram it in this way. Put it on a prepositional phrase and modifying offer. Offer a crown to N. Offer N a crown. And the next sentence, made Anne a queen. So now this is further explanation why we want sentence diagramming. Once you can diagram the two sentences, you will clearly see they look very different structurally. The second one, you have 4 slots above the main line, when the first one, you only have 3. Another way to think about this distinction is this way. In pattern number 8, how many objects we have? Or how many essentially different nouns? We have 3, right? We have king, which is subject. We have Anne, which is indirect object. And then we have a crown. We have 3 different things. But how many in the second sentence? We only have 2. We have 2 people, king and Anne. Queen, how about queen? Queen is the same as Anne. So we only have 2 reference here, and we have 3 in the first version. That's a very helpful way to understand this. So although this can have a different caveat, so that's just we have a reflective pronoun. Remember what is a reflective pronoun? The king made himself a drink. Well, in that case, a drink, that's just, well, first of all, if we say the king made himself a drink, what sentence is that? Is number 8 or number 10? It's number 8, right? It cannot be number 10. King and drink, not make himself a drink. He converts himself to a drink. That would be ridiculous. So the king made the drink for himself. But in that case, how many references we have? Because we use a special reflective pronoun, the indirect object is the king subject itself. That's a kind of just a special case, okay? Although we generally say in pattern number 8, we have 3 reference here, but in this particular case, because he uses reflective pronoun, so himself is king, so you only have 2. But that's a kind of just exception, a special case. Okay. Now, we have one important thing we may not be able to finish. We only have 5 minutes left, but this is a thing that we may actually. So, yeah, let's discuss this first. So we say that prepositional phrase can be used as adjective, right? So in the case of object complements, it turns out that in many cases we can replace the adjective with a kind of prepositional phrase, essentially serving the same thing. For example, if we say, she found the king merry, meaning that she saw that the king is happy, found the king happy, we can also use a kind of equivalent prepositional phrase, say, she found the king in a good humor, in a good mood, and so on. It just kind of just structurally the same thing. Except the diagram will become a little bit difficult, but we know how to overcome that because we say that an adjective usually is a modifier beneath the main line, and when it's above the main line, it's kind of complement. Now we know complement can be both subject complement or object complement. If you have single word, that's easy, just put it there. But what if you have a prepositional phrase? But we know how to do that. We raise it. We use a pedestal to raise that. So it just, for this version, how should we diagram in good humor? We know this in good humor, it's a object complement. It must be above the main line. It should not go beneath the main line on the king. Because it's not a direct modifier, it's a complement. So we do like this. And we have seen this quite a few times, right? We use a pedestal to raise the prepositional phrase. That's the only way to make sense, because otherwise you just cannot put the prepositional phrase structure above the main line, because this diagonal line segment cannot be attached to the main line when it's above it. So we raise it in this way. Okay? Okay. I originally mean to discuss this prepositional phrase as asked. So why don't we do this next time? Because that's just quite a bit of work. So we will stop here today. We introduced 3 additional patterns for the simple sentence. They all involve how to add additional information about the object. And in the next lecture, we will finish the last pattern, which is you have SVO, but you also need some additional adverbs to complete the idea. That's pattern number 11. And a lot of books will not actually list this separately, but I think it will help if we discuss that separately. And we will also discuss something called expletive, which you just saw, but we will not discuss that today because we don't have much time. Okay, I will see you next week. Bye.